Chapter 421, Outsider. Eliana's world had collapsed into pain. But this was worse. The agony tearing through her body was unbearable. But the betrayal. That was what made her blood boil, what made her want to claw at him, to scream, to fight. And still Luca just watched, silent, unshaken, unmoved. Her breath came in ragged, uneven gasps, the cursed veins in her arms pulsing as if alive. She forced herself to look up at him, her vision swimming, her hatred burning through the haze. You! Her voice was hoarse, raw. Her fingers curled weakly against the ground, trembling with fury. Her lips trembled, the words breaking between gasps of pain. You bastard! Luca didn't flinch, didn't react. You used me. Her body spasmed violently, but she forced herself up, even if it was just an inch, even if every nerve in her body screamed for her to collapse. Was this always your plan? She choked out. Was I just a tool to you? Luca exhaled softly, tilting his head slightly, his expression unreadable. And then his lips parted. I indeed used you, he said smoothly, without hesitation. Eliana's breath hitched, her entire body shaking. Luca crouched slightly, lowering himself just enough so that his gaze met hers. His dark, bottomless eyes reflected the firelight, but for some reason, she couldn't see past them. They shone, but the light wasn't warm. It wasn't soft. It was obscuring, blinding, a cruel, celestial glow that made it impossible to see what lay beneath. And, he murmured, can you do anything about it? Eliana's chest constricted, white-hot rage coiling through her even as her body betrayed her. Luca's smirk widened as he studied her. Not with amusement, not with mockery, but with something far worse. Indifference. At least that was how she had seen in her mind, as that light obscured her vision completely. She glared at him, her vision narrowing to a single point. That was all she had left. The last bit of strength, the only thing she could still do. And yet, Luca chuckled softly. That is a fierce glare, he mused. Will that work, though? Eliana gasped sharply as her body convulsed again. More of that dark blood spilling from her lips, staining the stone beneath her. Her vision was flickering, collapsing, but she refused to break. Will that fierce gaze save you? She hated him. She had never hated someone this much in her entire life. All the things, she rasped. All the things you said, about being different. Her body trembled violently, her fingers digging into the ground. They were just lies, weren't they? Luca's smirk widened. But, for just the briefest moment, Eliana saw it. A faint twitch at the corner of his mouth. A hesitation. Something almost off. She barely had time to register it before the fury consumed her again. To her, it was nothing more than mockery. Her nails scraped against the stone. Luca's voice dropped lower. What do you think? Something inside her snapped. Her teeth clenched so hard it made an audible grinding sound. And in that moment, hatred and rage were the only things keeping her alive. Eliana's world shattered. Everything she had ever known was breaking apart, just like the body she could no longer control. The pain was unbearable, but the betrayal, the sheer, soul-crushing weight of it, was worse. Her entire life she had been cast aside. She had been nothing but a burden. Too weak, too fragile. A nuisance to her father. A disgrace to her bloodline. The people around her had always worn masks. Pretending, whispering, waiting for her to finally break. She had never been wanted. Never been chosen. Never been anything. And then he came along. Lucavion. The man who had carried her through battle. The man who had smirked at her, challenged her, made her feel like she could stand beside him rather than constantly being dragged along. She thought, no, she believed he was different. But now he was just like the rest of them. No, he was worse. He had lied. He had used her. And he was watching her die without a second thought. Something cracked inside her. Her trembling lips curled back, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. And then, I hate you. Her voice was hoarse, but the words carried like a curse, laced with something raw and unforgivable. Her fingers scraped against the stone, her body writhing, her vision swimming in and out of focus. "I hate you." The force of her scream ripped through her lungs, tore through her throat, so violent it felt as though it would burn her from the inside out. But it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. "I will kill you," she shrieked, her voice breaking, her entire body convulsing violently. "I will butcher you alive." Luca remained still, watching, letting it happen. His silence only made her rage burn hotter. "Do you hear me, you bastard?" she screamed, her throat raw, her chest heaving as if the words themselves could rip free from her skin. "I will tear you apart piece by piece." Her nails curled against the stone, digging in so hard they cracked, but she didn't stop. "I will rip out your heart and watch you bleed." The cavern walls trembled with the sheer ferocity of her voice. "I swear to the gods, to the heavens, to everything that exists, I will make you suffer." And still, Luca just stood there, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes glowing, obscuring, mocking. Eliana snapped completely. "I hope you rot, you monster," she screamed. "I hope you burn in a pit so deep even hell would reject you." She spat at him, blood and fury mingling in her mouth. "I hope you die alone, forgotten, just like you deserve." Her voice was a broken thing, raw and vicious, but she did not stop. She could not stop. Every ounce of hatred, of grief, of pain she had ever held inside, she let it spill out, unchecked, like an endless, raging storm. And Luca, he only listened, and that made it worse. Eliana wanted something out of him, a flicker of remorse, a sliver of regret, anything. She wanted to see him react, to see him hurt, but he didn't. He just stood there, silent, detached, unmoved, and it drove her mad. Her body trembled violently, but she kept screaming, kept spitting out every ounce of hatred she had buried inside her for years. "Is that it?" she shrieked, her voice breaking. "You don't even have the decency to defend yourself?" Luca's expression remained unreadable. "Say something," she choked, her throat raw, her lungs burning. "Say anything, you coward." Nothing. Eliana's vision swam, fury and pain blurring everything together, but she didn't stop. Was it fun? Using me? Her hands slammed against the cold stone, her nails cracking against the jagged surface. "Was I nothing more than a toy for you to throw away when you were done?" Still, Luca didn't answer. Eliana let out a ragged, gasping breath, hatred coiling around her like something alive, something monstrous. She didn't realize it at first, but the air around her had begun to shift. A faint glow flickered around her body, pulsing like an unsteady heartbeat. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable against the firelight. And then, shriek, a sound like tearing reality itself. A piercing, inhuman wail that sent vibrations through the air, rattling her skull, shaking the cavern walls. The ground beneath them rumbled. Eliana froze. Her hatred still burned, her body still trembled, but something deeper stirred inside her. A primal, suffocating force pressing down from above. Luca exhaled softly, as if bored, and raised his head. "It appears that our talk is over." Eliana's breath hitched. She followed his gaze, dragging her aching body to look upward. And there, beyond the cavern ceiling, where the eerie, starless sky stretched out into an abyss, a shadow, massive, moving, watching, a shape too vast, too terrible to comprehend. And then, a single, monstrous tentacle came crashing down. Chapter 422. Outsider 2. It appears that our talk is over. Eliana's heart pounded in her chest, her mind struggling to process what was happening. The Kraken. It was here. And it was coming for them. No, not them. For her. She could feel it, a primal, instinctive pull that made her skin crawl. The glow around her intensified, the light growing brighter, more erratic, as if responding to the creature's presence. Luca's gaze flicked back to her, his dark eyes meeting hers for the briefest moment. There was something in his expression, something she couldn't quite place. Not fear, not concern, but anticipation? Resignation? She couldn't tell. And then he turned away, his focus shifting to the descending tentacle. Eliana's breath hitched, her body trembling as the reality of the situation crashed over her. The Kraken was here, and it was coming for her. She wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but her body refused to move. She was trapped by her pain, by her rage, by the glowing energy that now surrounded her like a cage. The tentacle was close now, close enough that she could see the suction cups lining its underside, each one large enough to crush her in an instant. She braced herself, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her ears. And then, just as the tentacle was about to strike, Luca moved. Swoosh! Luca moved like a shadow slipping through cracks in the air. His body propelled forward with an unnatural grace. His estoc was already drawn, black starlight gathering along its length as he surged toward the descending tentacle. His movements were impossibly smooth, a seamless transition between stillness and lethal intent. His body coiled for a fraction of a second, then exploded forward. Void Starfall Blade, Starline. The instant the words left his lips, the air around him shuddered. A thin, radiant line of black starlight traced the path of his blade as he slashed diagonally through the thick, writhing appendage. Boom! The moment the strike connected, the starlight expanded, an eruption of force blasting outward from the thin line he had carved through the tentacle. A wave of distortion rippled through the flesh of the monstrous limb, and in the next instant, crack! The massive tentacle was torn apart along the line of impact, its own weight dragging it violently to the side as the severed chunk fell away. A spray of dark, brackish liquid erupted from the wound, splattering across the battlefield in thick, sludgy arcs. Luca twisted his body midair, his foot barely brushing the ruined stone of the courtyard as he launched himself backward, escaping the immediate area of impact. His breath was steady, controlled, his eyes cold as he observed the result of his strike. The Kraken recoiled. A deep, guttural sound reverberated through the air, something between a roar and an unearthly shriek. The force of it sent tremors through the ground, making the already broken structures around them groan in protest. Eliana gasped, her wide eyes locked on Luca. He had moved faster than she could even register. One moment he was still, and the next he had shattered one of the Kraken's limbs as if it were nothing. And yet, the severed tentacle crashed into the cavern floor with a sickening, wet thud, splattering brackish ichor across the stone. The force of its impact sent tremors through the ground, loose debris tumbling from the jagged ceiling above. But even as the limb writhed in its death throes, the wound was already knitting itself back together. CLRKKK. The sound was grotesque, like flesh reweaving itself in fast motion. The Kraken's regeneration was instantaneous, dark energy crackling along the severed edges as new flesh coiled and twisted into shape. The gaping wound Lucavion had carved out mere moments ago had already sealed itself, as if the strike had never happened. Lucavion clicked his tongue, tilting his head slightly as he took in the sight. "Well, that's just unfair," he murmured, though there was no real frustration in his voice. If anything, his lips curled into something dangerously close to amusement. "So, you regenerate instantly, do you?" He chuckled, tapping his estoc lightly against his shoulder. "I guess I should have expected as much. It wouldn't be fun otherwise." Eliana barely registered his words. She was still gasping, her body racked with pain, barely clinging to consciousness as the glow around her pulsed erratically. Her entire body was screaming at her to collapse, to give in. But her hatred burned, white-hot and searing, keeping her conscious even as her limbs trembled. The Kraken did not hesitate. Shriek! The cavern walls trembled as the monster let out a deafening, mind-rattling shriek. The sheer force of the sound sent a violent shockwave through the air, cracking stone and forcing Eliana's already struggling body to convulse in pain. And then boom! A second tentacle lashed down toward Lucavion with terrifying speed, its monstrous weight cutting through the air like a guillotine. Swoosh! Lucavion moved. He twisted his body at the last possible moment, a single step carrying him out of the tentacle's devastating path. The air pressure from the impact alone sent his coat billowing, his silver-streaked hair whipping around him as the stone beneath him shattered from the force of the blow. But he wasn't done. Even as he dodged, his void starfall blade was already in motion. Slash! His estoc carved through the kraken's thick, grotesque flesh in a precise, almost effortless motion. The dark steel of his blade glowed with a starry shimmer, leaving behind a thin, crackling line of starlight energy in its wake. For a second, there was silence. Then, boom! A violent explosion of force erupted from the wound, severing another chunk of the kraken's limb. Ichor sprayed across the battlefield once more, the sheer impact sending tremors through the cavern. Lucavion landed gracefully a few paces away, adjusting his grip on his sword as he studied his opponent. His smirk widened. "Still not enough, huh?" he mused, watching as the kraken's wounds began to heal yet again, the grotesque process unfolding before his eyes. The monster's remaining limbs twisted in agitation, its abyssal eyes narrowing as if recognizing Lucavion as a true threat. SHRRRRKKKKKKKK. Without warning, 3 more tentacles surged toward him, their sheer size eclipsing the cavern's already limited space. They came from multiple directions at once, each one moving with unnatural speed, leaving no room to escape. "Ah, there it is," Lucavion thought, his smirk deepening. "The moment when they stop underestimating me." Boom, boom, boom. The tentacles descended. Swoosh! Lucavion's body blurred. He moved like falling starlight, his steps impossibly fast, fluid, weaving between the monstrous appendages with a speed that defied logic. Each time a tentacle struck the ground, it left behind massive craters, obliterating everything in its path, but not him. His blade was already carving through the air. Clang, slash, CHLKT. Each movement was precise, lethal. Tentacles were severed in the blink of an eye, the wounds glowing with that eerie, crackling starlight energy that prevented them from regenerating immediately. The kraken shrieked in agony, but Lucavion wasn't finished. He launched himself skyward. A single step on the air propelled him higher, above the chaos, above the carnage, until he was directly above the kraken's massive, writhing body. And there, suspended in the air, his dark coat billowing, his blade gleaming with an ominous, celestial glow, Lucavion smirked. "Not so tough when you're not swinging those limbs around, are you?" he taunted, his voice dripping with amusement. He twisted his wrist, adjusting his grip on his estoc. His blade thrummed with power. "Let's see how you like this. Void Starfall Blade, Event Horizon." The moment he uttered the name of his technique, the cavern went silent. And then boom, a pulse of pure starlight energy erupted from his blade, collapsing the very space around it. For a single, terrifying instant, it was as if reality itself warped inward, crushing everything caught within its radius. And the kraken? It reeled. Its body convulsed violently, its monstrous form buckling under the sudden, overwhelming force. The very fabric of its existence seemed to strain against the attack, the eldritch energy that sustained it clashing with the starlight trying to erase it. For the first time since the battle began, the kraken hesitated. Lucavion's smirk widened. "Heh, got your attention now, don't I? Shururiani K." The kraken's scream was one of pure rage. And then, it evolved. The air around it shifted, dark energy surging outward in a violent wave. The wounds Lucavion had inflicted healed twice as fast, the kraken's body growing larger, stronger, its abyssal eyes glowing with something different. Not just anger, recognition. Lucavion's eyes narrowed slightly, his amusement not fading, but his grip on his estoc tightening just a fraction. "Ah!" he mused, rolling his shoulder as the starlight energy in his blade intensified. "So, you're finally taking me seriously, huh?" He grinned, stepping forward as the kraken's monstrous energy surged once more. "Good." His blade hummed, That makes two of us. Chapter 423, Outsider 3. Ileana could barely breathe. The world was slipping, flickering between two realities, both equally surreal, equally horrifying. The cavern, the kraken, and beyond that, the strange, dreamlike dimension that clawed at the edges of her vision. There was something watching, waiting. Pitchfork element of opening upward element of opening upward element of opening upward element of opening upward element of opening upward. The noises filled her head, incomprehensible whispers that slithered through her thoughts like oil, twisting around her mind, sinking into her very being. She didn't understand, couldn't understand, but they were there, pressing against her skull like 1,000 unseen hands. Yet, despite that, her eyes kept returning to him. Lucavion, standing before that thing, before the kraken. It was huge, unfathomably massive, a creature born of nightmares, its grotesque form pulsating with an abyssal energy that made the very air vibrate. It radiated power, its sheer presence enough to crush lesser beings into the ground. And he was still there, facing it, fighting it. Her body burned, her cursed veins pulsing, her breath ragged. But her mind couldn't let go of a single brutal thought. Why is he fighting? This thing, this monster, was after her, not him. So why wasn't he just letting it take her? Why was he standing there, blade drawn, grin sharp enough to cut through the very fabric of existence itself? She hated him. She hated him. Didn't she? Didn't she? I hate him. The thought echoed in her head, trying to take root, trying to cling to her like a lifeline. But even as she forced herself to hold on to it, she saw it, that look in his eyes, that madness, that smile. A twisted, exhilarated grin spread across his face, his dark eyes alight with something wild, unhinged, like he was enjoying this, like the fight itself was what mattered, like everything, this place, this moment, her suffering, like it was all just a game to him. Her stomach twisted, her vision blurred. The whispers clawed at her mind again, but she couldn't look away. Top of form, bottom of form. The kraken loomed before me, its abyssal eyes gleaming with something beyond primal hunger. Recognition, understanding, a knowing that stretched past the physical, past the battlefield, past the clash of blade and limb. And beneath that knowing, I felt it. A pulse, a tether, a resonance deep within my core, thrumming in time with the eldritch energy swirling around the creature. It wasn't just a monster, not just another obstacle to be cut down. No, this thing was something else. And it was calling to me. Indeed. This sensation. It was the same as when I had first forged my core, when I had shattered my limits under the weight of Devourer of Stars. That dream, that vision, where countless stars burned across an infinite void. And mine? Mine was black. Even then I had known. There was something else in me, something beyond the system of cultivation I had been taught. Gerald had felt it. Master had warned me of it. And now, standing before this thing, this grotesque convergence of abyssal energy, I felt it again. Familiar. For the first time since the battle began, I hesitated. And in that hesitation, the kraken struck. Boom! A massive tentacle lashed out, warping the very air with its sheer force. My body moved on instinct, too late. The impact grazed my side, pain flaring sharp and electric as the force sent me skidding across the ruined stone. I landed in a crouch, exhaling through my teeth. The pain settled, a dull ache already fading into the background, pushed aside by something sharper. Excitement. Heh. Sloppy. And yet, my lips curled into a smirk, because now I was sure. This wasn't just an anomaly. It wasn't just some overgrown sea horror with regeneration too annoying for its own good. The thing inside the kraken, the thing that resonated with me, was something more, something deeper, something waiting. I straightened, rolling my shoulder as the starlight along my estoc pulsed, faint embers of void light flickering through the air. The kraken reared back, its remaining limbs writhing, but its abyssal gaze never left mine. It knew, and so did I, as expected. I murmured to myself, absently tapping my estoc against my shoulder. my voice barely louder than the crackle of abyssal energy in the air. When it comes to lore and fantasy, a romance fantasy novel falls short in expansion. The Kraken loomed, its grotesque form shifting, distorting, as though it too was listening. The resonance between us deepened, the pulse in my core growing stronger. The weight of the moment pressed against my skin, but my mind was elsewhere. Shattered innocence. In the original novel, this entire event, the emergence of a Kraken in the Thaddeus Duchy, had barely been a footnote. A brief mention, a passing reference, nothing more. The book never explored it, never lingered on the details of the destruction it wrought, the chaos it left in its wake. Because it didn't matter. Not to the story. Not to Alara's path. The book skipped over it entirely, jumping straight to the Academy arc after her banishment, using fragmented flashbacks to hint at the devastation that had unfolded. A duchy nearly destroyed. A duke who almost lost his right arm. A shift in the political landscape. Power scrambling to fill the void left in the wake of the disaster. And, most importantly, Alara. The novel barely scratched the surface of what this event did to her. How it shaped her. How it carved itself into her story like an unspoken scar. It was a choice of the author, and it could be understood. I could understand it. The choice of the author. The way the story was structured. Shattered Innocence had always been more about Alara than the world she existed in. It was her journey, her suffering, her growth. Everything else, the political shifts, the tragedies of others, was simply background noise, events meant to propel her forward. And I could respect that. After all, a tightly woven narrative had its strengths. A story that didn't meander, that stayed focused on its protagonist, was compelling in its own way. But at the same time, it didn't do her justice. Alara had taken my place in the original story. She was the one who had fought the Kraken. The one who had somehow found Aliana. And she was the one who had befriended her. Aliana, who was never your typical noble lady. Who didn't fit into the mold of delicate refinement the world expected of her. Who carried her scars with an inherent resentment, because no matter how strong she was, no matter how much she endured, there was always someone who had it easier. And that someone was Alara. Their dynamic had been interesting. Alara, the protagonist, blessed by fate, beautiful, powerful, beloved, and Aliana, born cursed, carrying the weight of her affliction in every fiber of her being. Of course, she had resented her. And yet, somehow, they became friends. Not because Alara pitied her, nor because Aliana wanted to be saved, but because Alara was stubborn in the way only a protagonist could be. And Aliana, for all her resentment, found herself intrigued. The book had painted their friendship in fragmented moments, scattered through flashbacks. Small glimpses into the past, scattered breadcrumbs meant to make Alara's later grief more impactful. But that was the problem, wasn't it? It was never about Aliana. It was about Alara's loss. About the pain of losing a friend, rather than the depth of the bond itself. And now, standing here, living in the unwritten pages of this world, I found myself irritated by that fact. Because I was seeing Aliana in real time. I was watching her struggle, watching the way her body trembled, the way her breaths came in sharp, ragged gasps. I could feel the weight of the whispers clawing at her mind, see the way she refused to look away from me, even as she drowned in whatever hell her body was forcing her through. It may be a bit cruel and hard for you. The words I had spoken might have been harsh. I knew how hurtful they can be. But, you see, hatred is a strong feeling. With a condition like hers, I wanted her ending to be different. Chapter 424. Outsider 4. It was ironic, really. Protagonists were supposed to change everything. Their presence bent the world, shifted the tides, rewrote the fate of those around them. They were the axis upon which the story turned. And yet, Alara, who had befriended Aliana, who had tried to save her, had failed. No matter how much she had fought, no matter the strength of their bond, it hadn't mattered in the end. Aliana had still lost herself. To her curse, to her illness, to the inevitable spiral that the novel had already written for her. Shattered Innocence had cooked with that twist. The protagonist, bound by fate rather than defying it. The world, unwilling to let her rewrite certain tragedies. And it had been good. But now, this world was no longer a book. It was real. And I was here. Which meant I didn't have to accept that ending. My grip tightened around my estoc, the void light along its edge pulsing in time with the abyssal energy surrounding us. The Kraken loomed, waiting, watching, its resonance with me deepening. But my focus wasn't on it. It was on her, Aliana, whose body trembled, barely able to stand, yet still glaring at me with something raw and unyielding. Aliana, who had every reason to collapse, every reason to give in, yet refused to look away. It may be a bit cruel and hard for you. I knew the weight of my words. I knew how much they could cut. But, you see, hatred is a strong feeling. And with a condition like hers, she would need it. Because hatred, resentment, rage, fury, was an emotion strong enough to keep a person alive. I knew that better than anyone. I had seen how far it could push a man, how it could keep them fighting long past their limits, keep them moving even when the world had long since turned against them. Because I had lived it, and if it worked for me, then maybe it would work for her too. I exhaled, stepping forward, meeting her unsteady gaze. My smirk softened just slightly. Hope you don't resent me too much. Then I turned back to the Kraken, lifting my blade. Time to see if fate could still be rewritten. Boom! The Kraken lunged. But I was already moving. My body twisted, feet barely grazing the broken stone as I evaded its strike with ease. No, with certainty. As expected. My eyes flicked over the Kraken, watching as something new coiled around its grotesque limbs, slithering through the thick, pulsing flesh. Starlight energy. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Flickering like dying embers, yet carrying a weight far beyond this creature. Beyond this world. So it's true then. The monster's energy finalized my doubts. In the novel, the Kraken's connection to something greater, something outside, was only revealed near the very end. That time it wasn't Aliana. It was someone else. A male lead. A favored son of fate. Another disaster. Another tragedy. Another nearly irreversible curse. But this time, because it happened after the Academy arc, Elara had been strong enough to stop it. And when she did, when the monster fell, broken and writhing in its final death throes, something had been revealed. Inside that beast, inside its very essence, was something else entirely. The Kong. A sublime, blackish creature. Something not of this world. An outsider. An alien. Call it whatever you want. Duke Thaddeus had been the one to confirm it. He had seen it before, felt it before. And though the novel had never focused on him, his words had carried weight. Because the energy within that thing, the Kong, had been the same. The same as the Kraken. The same as the energy that had once nearly destroyed him. And it was the same star energy that I was seeing right now. The tendrils of void starlight coiling through the Kraken's massive body pulsed again. Stronger this time. The resonance between us deepened. A call and response that vibrated through my very core. I understood it now. This thing, this monstrous force. It wasn't just a mindless creature of the deep. It was a vessel. A host for something greater. Something older. Something wrong. The realization sent a slow, amused breath through my lips. Heh! No wonder the novel had only hinted at it. Only revealed the truth at the very end. Because this wasn't just a single disaster. This was a pattern. A deliberate force moving in the shadows of this world. Slipping through the cracks, infecting hosts, creating destruction at precise, calculated points in time. This Kraken. The monster that had nearly killed Thaddeus. The beast that had cursed the male lead. And who was to say how many more were out there? Ha! Looks like the world building was deeper than even the author intended. A slow smile curled onto my lips. I had expected this. That was why I had come here in the first place. Something had been calling me. A pull at the edges of my awareness. Subtle yet undeniable. The kind of instinct that couldn't be rationalized, that couldn't be explained in simple logic. It wasn't concrete, wasn't anything I could prove. Superstition? Intuition? Call it whatever you want. At the end of the day I had known. And I was right. My fingers flexed around the hilt of my estoc, the void light along its length pulsing in time with the foreign starlight that coiled around the kraken's massive body. It was coming down now, its colossal form twisting, shifting, breaking. Not from my attacks, but from within. Something inside it was stirring, unraveling, trying to claw its way free. And I could feel it. The resonance between us had deepened to something undeniable, something raw and vast and familiar. The condition for my breakthrough lies here. That thought settled into my mind with certainty. I had reached the limits of what this world's cultivation system understood. Devourer of Stars was never meant to follow the same path. My core had formed outside of convention. My ascension had been different from the rest. And now the answer was in front of me, because the Kraken was proof that I wasn't the only one. That something else, something older, had already walked this path before. I exhaled, rolling my shoulders as I met the abyssal gaze of the dying monster. Good, I murmured, my smirk widening as I shifted my stance. Then let's see what you're really hiding. Boom, I surged forward. Chapter 425. Oudister 5. Boom. The Kraken's form twisted unnaturally, its massive bulk moving far faster than something of its size should be capable of. Its enormous tentacles lashed out in a blur of motion, cutting through the air with enough force to collapse the cavern walls. Swoosh! I dodged. My body moved instinctively, my feet barely grazing the ruined stone as I weaved through the onslaught. The tentacle struck where I had been a fraction of a second ago, shattering the ground into jagged debris. The air rippled from the sheer force of the blow, dust and ichor spraying in all directions. Another strike. Another. Swoosh, swoosh. I bent backward, narrowly avoiding a crushing sweep that would have flattened me. Another tentacle came from above, a blur of abyssal muscle descending like a falling mountain. This time I deflected. Clang. I twisted my estoc, angling the edge to redirect rather than resist. A pulse of black starlight flickered along the blade's surface, sending the Kraken's strike veering slightly off course. It wasn't enough to fully stop it, but enough to buy me the fraction of a second I needed to shift my weight and move. The impact missed me by inches, sending shockwaves through the battlefield. The cavern trembled, cracks splintering across the already ruined terrain. The sheer force sent loose debris tumbling from the jagged ceiling above. It's fast. It was regenerating, too. Every time my blade carved into its grotesque flesh, the wounds stitched themselves back together. The black, brackish ichor spilled from its injuries, but it didn't weaken. If anything, it seemed to be getting stronger. TCH. Annoying. I exhaled, rolling my wrist, my estoc humming with faint starlight energy. My body burned with exertion, the wounds along my ribs and arms throbbing. But I didn't stop. This fight was dragging on. It's not good. And it was not. After all, the more this monster lived, the more it fought, the harder it would get for me. I can't match its regeneration. Maybe if there were other monsters that were around here, then it could have been possible. After all, I could utilize Flame of Equinox to absorb their vitality. Vitaliera would help as well. But none of these two above conditions were met. Hence, there was not much that could be done. I stepped forward, blade rising. Void Starfall Blade. Star Search. The air shuddered. A deep pulse of black starlight radiated from my weapon, expanding outward in sharp, crackling arcs. The energy around me condensed, space bending as the technique activated. And then, I vanished. Or rather, I moved too fast to be seen. A streak of starlight tore across the battlefield, my figure blurring into a trail of pure, condensed energy. My estoc carved through the Kraken's defenses, the force of the strike expanding the moment it connected. Boom! The impact was devastating. The black starlight exploded outward, carving through the Kraken's grotesque flesh in a spiral of obliterating force. A massive section of its body was severed, black ichor spraying into the air like a ruptured dam. For a moment there was silence. And then, SCHLRKKK, the sound of flesh reforming. I watched, my smirk fading slightly as the severed wound stitched itself back together, the Kraken's body regenerating in mere seconds. My attack had landed, but it hadn't worked. My smirk twisted into something colder. I exhaled, adjusting my stance, but before I could move, boom, a tentacle came from my blind spot. I twisted, too late. The impact slammed into my side, pain exploding through my ribs as I was sent flying. Crash. I hit the ground hard, skidding across the ruined battlefield before slamming into a broken pillar. Blood filled my mouth, the taste sharp and metallic. My fingers tightened around my weapon, my breaths coming out ragged. "Tsh, so it's like this, huh?" I clenched my jaw, pressing a hand to my side, feeling the deep gash along my ribs. My mind was working, analyzing, dissecting. My technique had been perfect. And yet, it wasn't enough. Why? What was I missing? I gritted my teeth, pushing myself to my feet. My vision blurred for a moment before sharpening, my gaze locking onto the Kraken's writhing, abyssal form. The resonance between us was still there, pulsing, watching. I exhaled slowly, the taste of blood thick on my tongue. My ribs throbbed with each breath, the pain sharp but manageable. I tightened my grip on my estoc, forcing myself to ignore the lingering ache. Why? My technique had landed. It had cut through the Kraken. But it hadn't mattered. I channeled my core, willing the starlight energy into my blade. A soft hum reverberated through the air as black starlight pulsed along the weapon's edge, flickering with celestial brilliance. At the same time, I let my flame of equinox surge through my veins. Whoosh! Blackish flames coiled around me, licking at the air with an eerie, consuming heat. Unlike ordinary fire, this was something more, something that straddled the line between life and death. For now, I need to understand. It wasn't going to be that easy. I knew that. I didn't expect a simple answer. But I needed something. I shifted my stance, my vision locking onto the Kraken once more. Its abyssal form pulsed, its grotesque limbs twisting, shifting unnaturally as it watched me. It was waiting, almost as if it knew I hadn't figured it out yet. Tch. Annoying. Boom. I shot forward. My movements blurred into streaks of starlight, the celestial energy crackling around my frame as I closed the distance in an instant. My estoc slashed out, carving through the thick mass of flesh before twisting in an elegant arc. Slash, slash, slash. Each strike landed with pinpoint precision. Each cut was clean. Each wound burst apart with black flames and searing starlight. But none of them mattered. Schlrkkk. The Kraken's wounds stitched themselves back together before I had even finished my next attack. Not enough. Swoosh. I twisted midair, dodging a massive tentacle that came crashing down where I had stood. My body flickered again, moving with the momentum of my strikes, my blade lashing out in rapid succession. Slash, slash, slash. Still nothing. Fine. I pivoted, pressing my free hand forward. Boom! Beams of starlight surged from my palm, arcs of pure celestial force ripping through the battlefield. They sliced through the Kraken's form, illuminating the cavern in a flash of radiant destruction. Then I shifted my mana. The flame of equinox flared up, black flames twisting into scorching waves as I unleashed them in rapid succession. Projectiles of death and fire shot toward the Kraken, consuming the very air as they tore forward. Boom! 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 The cavern shook from the force of the attacks. And yet, when the smoke cleared, the Kraken remained, untouched. The wounds I had inflicted were already gone, the regeneration surging faster than ever. I landed several paces away, breath steady but gaze cold. No, this isn't working. My flames weren't stopping it. My starlight wasn't enough. Even the combined force of my techniques, something that should have erased lesser creatures entirely, was useless. Tch. I exhaled sharply, rolling my wrist, feeling the black light flickering at the edge of my consciousness. There was something I wasn't seeing, something I was missing. Heh! But that was the fun part. Hee hee. The answer was here, right in front of me, Stepping into the unknown. I just had to figure it out. Chapter 426. Outsider 6. Eliana watched. She couldn't stop watching. The battlefield was chaos. An endless, violent blur of motion. But her eyes never left him. Lucavion, moving like a living star. A streak of black starlight carving through the air. His blade danced in elegant arcs. Each strike perfect. Each movement precise. And yet, it wasn't enough. The Kraken was different now. Stronger. Faster. Its wounds no longer just healing. They were becoming impenetrable. With every passing second, it adapted, shifting its monstrous form in unnatural ways. Its grotesque limbs pulsing with a dark energy that felt wrong. And then, he got hit. Boom! A tentacle slammed into him from behind, crushing force breaking the sound barrier as it sent him flying. Eliana's breath hitched. She had never seen him take a hit like that. Lucavion crashed hard, his body skipping across the ruined battlefield like a broken doll. The impact was enough to shatter stone. His coat torn, his body slamming into a jagged pillar with a sickening crack. Blood sprayed into the air. And yet, he stood. Of course he stood. Of course he did. Eliana clenched her fists, her own body trembling as the pulsing light around her flared erratically. Lucavion pressed a hand to his ribs, exhaling sharply. Blood dripped from the corners of his mouth, the wound deep, his breathing uneven. But still he grinned. That damn grin. That reckless, wild grin. His fingers curled around his estoc, his posture unshaken despite the pain. He was still standing, still fighting. But something was different now. Something she saw before anyone else. He was slowing down. Just a fraction. Just a moment. But it was there. The Kraken saw it too. It knew. It was waiting for this. Eliana's pulse pounded. The voices in her head growing louder, more alien, twisting through her thoughts like an infection. Pitchfork element of opening upward element of opening upward element of opening upward element of opening upward element of opening upward. She clutched her skull, her breath uneven. Shut up. She didn't want to hear it, didn't want to understand it. But her body, her soul was already changing. Her cursed veins pulsed harder. And this time, she didn't resist. This time, she accepted it. A revelation bloomed in the back of her mind. A truth she had never allowed herself to grasp. I am not weak. Her nails scraped against the broken stone as she forced herself to move. I was never weak. Pain seared through her limbs, her body screaming for her to stop. But she refused. She took a step forward. Then another. The glow around her flared brighter, her body trembling with something new, something undeniable. I won't let this define me. Eliana clenched her teeth, her breath ragged, and as she did, a sharp, grinding sound echoed through the battlefield. It was her teeth. She was gritting them so hard the sheer force of it reverberated through the air. And she kept walking, because Lucavion, that bastard, that liar, that monster, he was hers to kill. Not the Kraken, not this cursed land, not anyone else. She had meant every single word she had screamed at him, and she needed answers, which meant Lucavion wasn't allowed to die here. Eliana refused. She refused. Her body screamed, every nerve shredding from the inside out, her cursed veins pulsing with a violent, unbearable heat. It hurt. It hurt. A pain deeper than anything she had ever felt before, like her very soul was being ripped apart. But she would not fall. Her blurred gaze locked onto him. Lucavion, the bastard, the liar, the monster. She burned his image into her mind, every detail, every drop of blood smeared across his skin, every inch of his battle-worn coat, every flicker of madness in his starlit eyes. She would not let the Kraken take him from her. I will not let you take him from me. Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper, but the weight behind it cracked through the air. Her body begged for her to stop, to let go, to end it. Her very cells screamed for release, the agony drowning her, crushing her bones from the inside out. But still, I refuse. She refused. She reached inside herself, beyond the pain, beyond the overwhelming madness clawing at the edges of her mind. Her vision flickered, reality twisted, and then she saw it. Inside her, a writhing, slimy, disgusting mass of pitch-black darkness. Pulsed unnaturally, sickening, vile, wrong. It didn't belong there. It had never belonged there. But beside it, a color. A deep, rambling blue. It was not calm. It was not gentle. It was a storm. A raging ocean, swirling violently, fighting against the invading force. Called to her. Eliana's breath shuddered, her fingers twitching as she clung to it. This was hers. This storm. This raw, violent force surging through her veins. It was hers, and she would not let go. The moment Eliana clung to the storm, she felt it. A pulse. A deep, resonant force, something primal, something old. It surged through her veins, crashing like waves against the black mass inside her, colliding with it, fighting it. And then, the sky rumbled. A violent tremor echoed through this strange space, this dimension that wasn't quite real, wasn't quite a dream. The heavens above, if they could even be called that, shook, like something vast and unseen was awakening. And her body jolted awake. Aya! It hurts! The scream tore from her throat as pure, unfiltered agony flooded her. It was not pain from her body. It was not something as simple as flesh and bone breaking. This was deeper. This was her soul being shattered. The storm inside her clashed violently against the sickening black mass, crashing into it, tearing into it like a hurricane against a parasite that had burrowed too deep. It hurt. It hurt more than anything she had ever felt in her entire life. And at the exact same moment, Shrai, the kraken writhed. Its massive form lurched, its abyssal eyes widening, its monstrous limbs twisting unnaturally. Felt it too. It knew. Its grotesque, writhing tentacles shot forward, straight toward her. Eliana barely had time to register the incoming attack. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could barely even see through the unbearable, soul-crushing pain. But just before the massive limb could strike her, clank, a flash of black starlight, a sharp, metallic clash, and then, a voice. Not on my watch. Chapter 427, 5-star. Not on my watch. Eliana's vision snapped into focus, and there he was, Luca, before her, standing between her and the kraken's attack. His estoc gleamed, locked against the massive tentacle, void starlight crackling along its edge. The force of the impact sent shockwaves through the battlefield, his coat billowing, his stance unshaken. Despite the blood dripping from his lips, despite the wounds along his ribs, despite the fact that he was barely standing, he was still there. Eliana glared at him, her body still racked with pain, her breath uneven, her cursed veins pulsing with unstable energy. And yet, her rage burned hotter than all of it. You, she seethed, her voice raw with fury. You absolute bastard. Luca barely glanced at her, only shifting his eyes to the side for the briefest second. And of course, he smirked. A slow, infuriating smirk, blood still dripping from the corner of his mouth. His stance still defiant against the sheer force of the kraken's limb. Shouldn't you worry about yourself? He mused, his tone laced with amusement. You see, we need to get out of here first, don't we? Eliana's fingers twitched, nails digging into the stone beneath her. Every ounce of pain, of hatred, of betrayal poured into the words that tumbled from her lips. Just you wait. Her voice was low, venomous. I will make sure. Luca chuckled. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't cruel. But it was enjoying this. He was enjoying her hatred, enjoying the way her rage curled around him, the way her words dripped with the promise of violence. It infuriated her. That I'll be the one to kill you. His smirk widened. Now that's the spirit. And with that, he pushed back against the kraken's limb, his blade flaring with void starlight as he knocked the monstrous tentacle aside, his body moving with that same reckless grace. Even as his wounds deepened, even as his breaths became just a fraction heavier, Eliana's entire body shook. From the pain, from the power raging inside her. From him. She didn't understand him. She would never understand him. But that didn't matter, because she would not let him die here. Not until she got her answers. Not until she had the chance to kill him herself. The Kraken shrieked, its abyssal cry shaking the very cavern itself. Its severed limbs writhed and regrew, grotesque tendrils stitching themselves back together in mere moments. But it wasn't just healing. It was adapting. Boom! Another tentacle descended, cutting through the air like a falling mountain. The sheer force of it sent shockwaves blasting across the battlefield. Lucavion moved. Swoosh! He twisted, stepping into the attack rather than away from it, his body slipping just beyond the crushing impact. The tentacle obliterated the stone where he had just stood, fissures cracking outward like a spiderweb. But even as the dust rose, his estoc was already in motion. Void starfall blade, crescent ruin. A flash of black starlight. A single, seamless arc. And the tentacle split apart. The Kraken shrieked again, but it wasn't done. This monstrous body pulsed, then twitched. Tiny pores along its remaining limbs flared open, releasing a barrage of high-speed, obsidian-like darts. They howled through the air, shrieking toward Lucavion like a rain of death. TSK. His eyes flickered, calculating their trajectory in an instant. Clang, clang, clang. Lucavion's blade danced. Each flick of his wrist sent void starlight slicing through the poisoned projectiles. He weaved between them effortlessly, his movements precise, too precise, as if he had seen this pattern 1,000 times before. Aeliana, still collapsed, barely managed to track his movements. Her body was screaming, her cursed veins pulsing erratically, but she could see it, his steps, his rhythm, like a shadow slipping between cracks in reality itself, like a monster playing with its prey. And then, crack, a monstrous glow built up in the Kraken's gaping abyss of a maw. Aeliana's breath hitched. It wasn't just a physical attack anymore. The cavern shuddered as an impossible force condensed within the Kraken's core, dark tendrils of purplish-blue energy spiraling together, forming a concentrated mass of outer-worldly starlight. The air collapsed inward, and then, boom! A pillar of cosmic destruction erupted from the Kraken's maw, a beam of raw, unearthly devastation aimed straight at Lucavion. There was no dodging it, no blocking it. No, Lucavion moved, but not alone. 1 second Aeliana was on the ground, her fingers still digging into the stone, rage clouding her vision. The next, Lucavion's arm wrapped around her waist. Her breath vanished, and then, swoosh, they blurred. The world twisted around them, the very air shattering as Lucavion dragged her into his speed. The cosmic beam annihilated everything in its path, carving a molten scar into the cavern, the sheer heat of it causing Aeliana's skin to prickle even from a distance. But she wasn't looking at the attack. She was looking at him. Lucavion's grip was solid, unyielding despite his injuries. His expression was calm, almost bored, as if he had seen this exact moment play out in his mind countless times before. His coat billowed as he landed lightly atop a crumbling stone platform, releasing her the second they were clear of the blast. Aeliana stumbled, her body still weak, but her glare was fierce. You! Lucavion smirked, taking a casual step forward, his estoc resting lazily over his shoulder. You should be thanking me, you know? He mused, his voice still carrying that infuriating amusement. Aeliana's nails scraped against the stone. I will kill him, but not here, not yet, because the Kraken wasn't done. Lucavion's eyes flicked back to the monstrous abyss before them. The creature's wounds were sealing faster. Its attacks were growing smarter. Ah, so that's how it is, he thought, rolling his shoulder. His free hand wiped the blood from his lips as his smirk widened. Lucavion's eyes widened, a flicker of realization sparking in their depths. The chaos of the battlefield seemed to fall away, the relentless shrieks of the Kraken fading into the background as his gaze locked onto the destruction left in the wake of the cosmic beam. A molten scar stretched across the cavern, the sheer power of the attack having carved a path of annihilation through stone and earth alike. The edges of the chasm glowed with residual heat, the air rippling with a lingering, suffocating pressure. "So that's what I was lacking," Luca murmured, his voice a mixture of fascination and something almost akin to satisfaction. Eliana's vision swam, her body still shaking, her cursed veins burning like fire beneath her skin. She barely registered the ground beneath her as Luca set her down, his grip firm but uncharacteristically gentle. She wanted to curse him, to scream at him, to tear him apart for every single thing he had done, for every word he had spoken, for every lie he had let her believe. But she had no strength left, no breath, only a fractured, searing pain coursing through her, an agony that felt as though it would devour her from the inside out. And Luca? He was staring at the destruction as though it held the answers to the universe itself. His lips parted, barely more than a whisper escaping them. Void. Chapter 428. What was happening? Day of the expedition. Duke Thaddeus sat in his private chamber, his desk illuminated by the flickering glow of oil lamps. The heavy scent of parchment and ink filled the air, mingling with the faint brine that seeped in from the open window. His fingers moved methodically, flipping through reports and signing off on orders, yet his mind was only half attentive. His thoughts kept drifting, his focus slipping like sand through his fingers. Beyond the walls of his estate, the expedition team was preparing to depart. He could hear the faint sounds of movement in the distance, the shifting of weapons, the murmur of voices, the rhythmic march of boots upon stone. The harbor would be alive with activity, the air thick with tension as sailors made their final checks and mercenaries steadied themselves for what lay ahead. And yet, something was wrong. He exhaled slowly, placing his quill back into its inkwell. His hand hovered over the latest report, an account detailing the most recent wave of sea monster attacks. The numbers were troubling. Too many ships lost, too many experienced crews wiped out. Even the adventurers who normally thrived off such crises were wary. The attacks had escalated too suddenly. The creatures weren't behaving as they normally did. The patterns were erratic, unnatural. The Duke's brows furrowed as an unease settled deep in his gut, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. It wasn't just the monsters. It was something more, something unseen. His fingers tapped against the parchment, his mind grasping for an answer he couldn't quite name. His instincts, honed by years of battle and politics, whispered to him danger. Slowly, his gaze drifted from his desk to the window. The sky beyond was vast and dark, a canvas of deep indigo stretching over the restless sea. The stars should have been clear tonight, but instead, they seemed dim, as if shrouded by something unseen. A cold wind curled into the room, rustling the papers on his desk. The Duke's jaw tightened. What is this feeling? It wasn't paranoia. He had lived long enough to recognize true premonition. It was the same instinct that had saved him on the battlefield, the same sense that warned him of shifting tides in court politics. Something was coming. He pushed his chair back and stood, stepping toward the window. His sharp eyes scanned the docks below, where the ships of the expedition sat waiting, their sails tightly bound, their hulls reflecting the moon's pale light. From this vantage point, everything looked as it should. No sign of disturbance, no evidence of immediate danger. And yet, his gaze lifted back to the sky. The clouds had begun to shift, thickening in a way that felt unnatural. A deep pressure filled the air, an oppressive weight that pressed against his chest. A storm? No, the winds were too still. The Duke exhaled sharply, his hand gripping the window frame. Am I imagining things? A foolish thought. He never ignored his instincts, and he wouldn't start now. But what could he do? There was no enemy to strike down, no warning he could send without looking like a man grasping at shadows. Still, something felt off. The sea was waiting, but for what? And little did he know, this was one of the decisions that he would regret the most. The chamber was deathly quiet, save for the slow, deliberate tapping of Duke Thaddeus' fingers against his desk. The flickering lamps cast long shadows across the room, their dim light barely illuminating the faces of the men before him. They stood in silence, worn, battered, and barely holding themselves together. His eyes drifted over them, taking in the raw devastation that clung to their forms. Captain Idrin, his most trusted knight, stood at the forefront, shoulders heavy with exhaustion. His once pristine armor was in ruins, dented, cracked, streaked with grime and dried blood. His face, normally disciplined and unshaken, was pale and hollow-eyed. His lips were pressed into a thin, almost lifeless line, but his eyes were the worst of all. Haunted. Next to him, Irinder, another of his knights, looked no better. His gauntlet trembled slightly where it rested against the hilt of his sword, and his breathing was shallow. He did not even lift his head to meet the Duke's gaze. Behind them, the remnants of the expedition, those who had survived, stood in grim silence. Some were visibly shaking. Others stared blankly at the ground as if their minds were still trapped in the horrors of what they had faced. It was worse than he had imagined. And the worst part of it all was that he had known. He had felt it before they ever left. The warning had been there, gnawing at the edges of his instincts, whispering of a disaster he could not see. That unnatural weight in the air, the shifting clouds, the eerie stillness before the storm. He should have acted. He should have sent more men, delayed the departure, done something. Instead, he had watched from the shore as the fleet set sail, pushing aside his unease as baseless paranoia. And then, 2 days later, the sky had darkened. The sun had been swallowed by thick, roiling clouds that stretched far across the horizon. A silence unlike anything he had ever known had fallen over the land. And then, a shadow, a monstrous, unfathomable shadow, so vast that it could be seen from land, slithering through the deep. The Duke had stood on the watchtower, his hands gripping the stone railing as he had stared out to sea, feeling an unfamiliar weight settle in his chest. Dread. And now, here they stood, the ones who had made it back. Idrin finally spoke, his voice hoarse, as if it had been scraped raw. "Your Grace." He hesitated, his throat working as though he were struggling to force the words out. Thaddeus did not rush him. Idrin swallowed hard before continuing. The expedition. It was a slaughter. No embellishment. No unnecessary words. Just the simple, devastating truth. Thaddeus felt something cold coil in his chest. "We didn't even have a chance to fight properly," Irinder added, his voice quieter, more brittle. It wasn't something we could prepare for." Thaddeus studied them, waiting for the words that would confirm what he already knew. Idrin exhaled shakily. "The sea. It turned against us." The Duke's brows furrowed. "Explain." Idrin looked up then, his bloodshot eyes filled with something between exhaustion and lingering horror. At first, it was as expected, smaller monsters, swarms of them, coming at us in waves. It was manageable, albeit overwhelming. But then, his breath hitched, and for a brief moment, he looked away as if the words themselves were too much to bear. Irinder picked up where he left off, his hands tightening into fists. Then it appeared. Silence pressed against the room. The Duke's fingers curled into a fist atop his desk. "What did?" Idrin met his gaze, and when he spoke, his voice was nearly a whisper. "A kraken." A chill ran through the room. The chamber remained deathly silent, the weight of Idrin's words sinking into the very walls. "Kraken." Duke Thaddeus didn't flinch. He simply nodded, his sharp gaze unwavering. He had already known. The moment he had seen that colossal shadow twisting beneath the waves, there had been no doubt in his mind. There was only one creature in this world vast enough to blot out the sea itself. The legendary tentacled beast of the abyss. The Kraken. "Go on," the Duke commanded, his voice even, controlled. Idrin hesitated for a moment before nodding. His hands, scarred and weathered from battle, clenched at his sides. "It came from the deep," he said, voice hoarse. "At first, we thought it was just another storm rolling in. The waves grew erratic, the wind howled, and the waters churned as if something beneath the surface had awoken." His throat bobbed as he swallowed, struggling against the memory. And then we saw them, the tentacles. A few of the other knights in the room shifted uncomfortably. One of the mercenary captains, a man who had fought in countless naval skirmishes, had his jaw clenched so tightly that the veins in his neck stood out. They rose from the water like towers of flesh, Irinder added, his voice barely above a whisper. Black as night, covered in unholy runes that shimmered in the dark. Some of them were thicker than the masts of our largest ships. The Duke's fingers tightened around the edge of his desk. So it really was the Kraken, he thought grimly. Idrin continued. At first it didn't attack, not directly. It merely moved. He exhaled shakily, as if saying the words aloud made them all the more real. It coiled through the sea like a living storm, its body hidden beneath the waves. But every time it shifted, the ocean responded. Ships capsized without being touched. The currents turned against us. It was as if the water itself had betrayed us. The Duke's lips pressed into a thin line. And then, Idrin's expression darkened, his eyes flickering with something hollow and raw. Then it struck. He looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers slowly, as if trying to ground himself. I remember the first ship it took, the Iron Drake. One moment, it was sailing ahead of us, its crew holding the line against the lesser sea beasts. The next, he snapped his fingers. Gone. Chapter 429. What was happening, too? Captain Idrin took a steadying breath, his fingers flexing as if trying to shake off the ghostly touch of the past. His words had been measured, but the weight of them filled the chamber like an oppressive fog. The surviving knights and adventurers stood in solemn silence, their faces drawn, their bodies stiff with the remnants of battle. Idrin exhaled, his gaze darkening. It happened all at once. The Duke leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable, though his eyes remained sharp. Explain. Idrin nodded grimly. The Iron Drake was the first to go. One moment, it was ahead of us, holding formation, its crew fighting the lesser sea beasts as planned. Then, he snapped his fingers, the sound cutting through the tense silence like a blade. Gone! A chill ran through the room. No embellishment, no hesitation, just the sheer, brutal truth. The ship didn't sink, Irinder added, his voice quiet but firm. It was taken. The Duke's fingers curled against the desk. Taken? Idrin nodded. A tentacle rose from the depths, as wide as the ship itself. It moved faster than anything that size should, faster than any of us could react. The Iron Drake was lifted, its hull groaning under the pressure. A pause, a tremor in his voice, and then it was dragged under. The mercenary captain standing nearby let out a shaky breath, his knuckles white against the hilt of his sword. The other knights, hardened men who had survived countless battles, remained silent, their faces pale with the memory. Idrin's voice hardened. No wreckage, no bodies, just gone. Silence stretched in the chamber, heavy and suffocating. And that was only the beginning, Irinder murmured, his hands clenched into fists, his knuckles turning bone white. Once it struck, the rest of the fleet fell apart. The sea turned against us. The currents shifted violently. Waves capsized ships that hadn't even been touched. The winds screamed as if the storm itself was alive. And the Kraken. It moved through it all like it commanded the ocean itself. The Duke's jaw tightened. He had known. He had felt it. And yet, hearing it confirmed did not ease the weight in his chest. Idrin forced himself to continue. We fought, of course. Tried to hold formation, to push back. Some of the adventurers managed to land blows on its tentacles. Enchanted arrows, fire magic, even lightning spells. But none of it mattered. The wounds sealed as if they had never been there. It didn't fight like a beast. His voice dropped, a whisper of disbelief. It fought like a god. Another silence. This time one of understanding. The Duke exhaled through his nose, his thoughts moving rapidly. He had fought against overwhelming odds before. He had seen monsters, creatures of nightmare and legend. But even so, Irinder shifted, stepping forward. His posture was rigid, formal, but there was something else beneath it, hesitation. A thought he was struggling to voice. "Your Grace," he said carefully, seeking permission. Thaddeus inclined his head. "Speak." Arinder took a slow breath, steadying himself. "That kraken. It wasn't normal." The Duke's gaze snapped to him, his expression sharpening. "Not normal." His voice was even, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. "How many krakens have you seen?" A small murmur rippled through the survivors. Arinder met the Duke's gaze head-on, undeterred. "None, Your Grace," he admitted. "Not before this." Thaddeus' fingers tapped against his desk, his narrowed eyes demanding an explanation. Arinder continued, his voice steady. "But there was someone who had seen something, who knew something. An adventurer. He was the one who saved many of us, who led a counterattack even when everything was falling apart." The Duke frowned. "Who?" Arinder straightened. "Luca, Your Grace. The swordsman." At that name, a shift went through the room. Some of the knights looked up in recognition, others exchanged glances. The Duke, however, remained still, waiting. Arinder took that as his cue to continue. Luca was the first to call it what it was. The moment he saw it, he knew. His voice dropped slightly, as if recalling the moment. He said, "We are against a kraken." The Duke's eyes flickered with something unreadable. He remained silent, waiting. Arinder pressed on. "But that wasn't the part that stood out, Your Grace." He hesitated, then took a breath. He also said, "This thing, whatever it is, doesn't just feel out of place. Feels wrong." That word hung in the air like a specter. "Wrong." The Duke's expression darkened. "Explain." Arinder swallowed. "He said that its movements, its presence, it didn't belong. It wasn't just a creature of the sea. It was something else." The room's temperature seemed to drop. Thaddeus leaned forward, his voice lower now. "And do you believe him?" Arinder met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, Your Grace." Arinder exhaled, steadying himself before continuing. "That kid. He wasn't normal." The Duke's gaze remained sharp, watching him with quiet intensity. "The way he fought," Arinder went on, his voice measured but firm. "It wasn't just skill. It was something more. He threw himself into the fight as if his life meant nothing, yet every move was calculated. His talent. It was beyond what should be possible for an adventurer of his rank." Thaddeus raised an eyebrow at that. "Are you certain?" Arinder nodded. "I watched him closely. From what I observed, his rank was only 4-star. Nothing more, nothing less." A slight pause. "And yet, he achieved that rank in the middle of the battle." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Some of the knights stiffened at the revelation, while the mercenary captain inhaled sharply. Even Idrin, who had remained silent until now, furrowed his brow. Thaddeus' fingers tightened slightly against the desk. His voice was quieter now, but it carried a heavy weight. "He broke through in the middle of the fighting?" "That is correct," Arinder confirmed without hesitation. The Duke's gaze darkened in thought. Breaking through a rank mid-battle was no ordinary feat, it was rare, exceptionally so. Most awakened required preparation, a controlled environment, time to focus. To ascend in the midst of chaos, with one's life hanging by a thread, that was the mark of either a reckless fool or a true warrior forged in the crucible of death. And something told him that this Luca was not a fool. Arinder wasn't finished. His voice lowered slightly, but the weight in his words increased. "Even though he was a 4-star awakened, it felt like he could go face to face against me." Thaddeus' eyes sharpened. "Against you?" A pause. Arinder nodded once, his expression grim. "A peak 5-star. The chamber fell into complete silence. The impact of his words settled over the room like a storm cloud. Idrin's jaw tightened slightly, his mind clearly working through the implications. The other knights and adventurers exchanged looks, some skeptical, others unnerved. The Duke, however, did not react immediately. He studied Arinder carefully, as if searching for any sign of exaggeration. He found none. Thaddeus finally leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the wooden surface. His voice, when he spoke, was softer than before, but laced with unmistakable intrigue. That is not something I can ignore. The flickering lamps cast shifting shadows across his face, accentuating the contemplative edge in his gaze. A 4-star holding his own against a peak 5-star? That was not merely talent. That was an anomaly. Irinder, Thaddeus said, his tone firm. Are you certain? The knight held his gaze. I am, your grace. Another beat of silence. Then the Duke exhaled through his nose, something unreadable flickering in his expression. If that is true, he murmured, then this Luca is no ordinary adventurer. No one reaches that level alone. His gaze flickered toward the knights. There is a high chance he is the disciple of a high-ranked awakened. Irinder inclined his head. That is my belief as well. The Duke's fingers steepled, his thoughts racing. If this Luca truly had a master of that caliber, then whoever trained him was someone of significant power. Someone who had cultivated him in secret. And if he broke through mid-battle against an opponent like the Kraken, it meant he had been on the edge of that threshold for some time, waiting for the right moment. A disciple of a master. A swordsman with an unnatural presence. A fighter whose rank did not reflect his true strength. Thaddeus' gaze drifted toward the window, where the distant sea stretched into the night. Interesting. For the first time since the disastrous expedition, a new thought took root in his mind. Luca. He would need to see this boy for himself. Chapter 430. What was happening? 3. The chamber was thick with tension, the weight of revelations hanging over them like an oppressive storm. Duke Thaddeus, fingers still steepled, exhaled through his nose, his gaze steady as he regarded Irinder. Where is this Luca now? He expected an answer that would lead to an inquiry, a way to summon the swordsman to question him directly. But the moment Irinder hesitated, Thaddeus knew something was wrong. The knight's jaw tightened, and his hands clenched at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reluctant. He was swallowed by the vortex, your grace. Silence. Thaddeus' fingers stopped tapping. A slow, heavy pause settled over the room as the words sank in. Swallowed. His voice remained steady, but there was a new sharpness beneath it, something keen and piercing. Irinder nodded. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. Yes, your grace. Idrin spoke then, his voice hoarse. We lost sight of him during the final moments of the battle. The Kraken had already decimated most of our forces, but the vortexes, they were the true death sentence. Another murmur passed through the gathered survivors. Some shifted uncomfortably, their faces darkened by memories they wished they could forget. Thaddeus narrowed his eyes. Explain. Irinder took in a slow breath, steadying himself before he spoke. The vortexes, your grace, they were unlike anything we've ever seen. They didn't behave naturally. They didn't move naturally. Idrin nodded grimly. At first, they appeared small, no different from whirlpools formed by the chaos of battle. But they grew fast, too fast. The sea itself twisted unnaturally, pulling everything into them. And once they took hold of something, it was gone. Thaddeus frowned. Gone? Ships are wrecked in storms. Men drown in the sea. What makes these vortexes different? Irinder's expression was grim. Because there were no bodies. The room grew colder. Thaddeus' gaze sharpened. No bodies? None, Idrin confirmed. His voice edged with something uneasy. Not a single survivor who got caught in them returned. No wreckage surfaced. No remains. The moment something fell in, it disappeared. Thaddeus felt something shift within him. A rare, unfamiliar feeling creeping at the edges of his mind. Doubt. Even in his years as a seasoned warrior, as a man who had faced countless horrors both natural and supernatural, this was something new. The sea devoured men, yes, but it returned them. A wreck, a body, something. For nothing to remain. And this happened to many? His voice was quiet now, but it carried a dangerous undertone. Irinder exhaled. Too many. We lost entire ships, not just to the Kraken but to those vortexes. Adventurers, knights, mages. Men of all ranks and skills were pulled in. No one who fell in resurfaced. It was as if the sea swallowed them whole. Thaddeus' eyes flickered. And yet Luca lasted. Arinder hesitated, then gave a slow nod. Yes, Your Grace. He was at the forefront, cutting through the Kraken's assault. Even when the battlefield was falling apart, he was still fighting. But then, he clenched his fists, his voice dipping lower. He pushed the mage Alara out of the way, saved her from being taken. Alara. That name was not unfamiliar to the Duke. He had heard reports of the young mage before, a skilled frostwielder. But right now, she was not the focus of his interest. Luca had pushed her out of the vortex's grasp, and had been taken himself. Thaddeus leaned back in his chair, his mind shifting through possibilities. The Kraken had been enough of a disaster, but these vortexes, they changed everything. A monster could be fought, a storm endured, but an unnatural force that erased men and ships from existence? That was something else entirely. And yet, in those final moments, Luca had been aware enough to act. A 4-star who fought like a 5-star. A man whose strength seemed to surpass his limits. A swordsman who might have been the disciple of a high-ranked awakened. And now he was gone. His fingers tightened against the armrest. This vortex, he finally said, his voice measured. You believe it was worse than the Kraken itself? Arinder's nod was immediate. Without question. Idrin exhaled. The Kraken was a force of nature, but we could see it. It was tangible. We could at least fight back, even if it was futile. His voice darkened. But the vortex, it chose its victims. It appeared suddenly, pulled men in, and left nothing behind. The Duke's expression remained unreadable, but his thoughts were already moving ahead. This was not just a failed expedition. This was something else. Something no man had foreseen. And Luca, whether by fate or by his own reckless will, had been taken by it. The question now was not whether he had fallen. The question was whether he would return. The heavy silence in the chamber was shattered by the sudden creak of the door. All heads turned as the sound of hurried footsteps echoed against the marble floor. Madalena, the Duke's most trusted attendant, ever poised and composed, now stood at the threshold of the room looking disturbed. Her usual mask of calm control had cracked, and her face, pale, almost bloodless, betrayed the urgency of her message. Thaddeus' sharp eyes narrowed. Something was wrong. Madalena took a deep breath before stepping forward. Though her formality remained intact, there was a slight tremor in her movements. Without waiting for permission, she bowed swiftly at the waist. "Forgive my intrusion, Your Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But this could not wait. Thaddeus didn't speak. He simply waited. Then, Madalena lifted her head, and in that moment, she dropped the weight of the world onto the chamber. Lady Aliana, her breath hitched. She was swallowed by the vortex. The chamber froze. For a moment, there was only silence. A deep, suffocating stillness that pressed down on the gathered knights like a crushing wave. The Duke did not move, did not even breathe. Then, what? His voice was quiet, almost too calm, but those present could feel the storm brewing beneath the surface. Madalena clenched her hands into fists at her sides. "It happened at the end of the battle," she continued, her voice straining to remain steady. The last of the vortexes had begun to dissipate, but then one surged beneath her platform. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. There was no time, no chance to react. Arinder and Idrin exchanged looks, their own horror deepening. Lady Aliana, the Duke's own daughter. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Madalena, still bowed before him, did not move. Her head remained lowered, her posture rigid, but even she could not suppress the slight tremor in her shoulders. The weight of the words she had spoken settled over the room like a suffocating storm. Aliana, his daughter, swallowed by the vortex. Thaddeus' fingers curled, gripping the armrest of his chair with such force that the wood groaned beneath his grasp. A crack splintered through the silence. Not from the furniture, but from the air itself. His pressure began to leak into the chamber. It was not conscious. It was not controlled. It was raw, unfettered, and as vast as the ocean beyond these walls. The air grew heavy. The flames of the oil lamps flickered wildly, as if gasping for breath. The gathered knights instinctively stiffened, their bodies tensing under the sudden shift in atmosphere. Idrun clenched his jaw, his hands tightening at his sides. Erinder, battle-hardened as he was, exhaled slowly through his nose, his fingers twitching as if resisting the urge to move. But it was Madalena who bore the brunt of it. The moment his gaze locked onto her, she felt it, the full, crushing weight of his fury. She had served him for years. She had stood by his side in court, in war, in the shadows of the empire where few dared to tread. She had seen the Duke strike down men with a single command, witnessed his cold, calculated decisions that shifted the balance of power with the precision of a master strategist. But this was not the Duke. This was a father whose daughter had been taken, and she was the one responsible. Madalena's breath hitched as the sheer pressure forced her deeper into her bow. The weight was immense, pressing against her bones, squeezing her chest until she could barely inhale. And then the Duke spoke. His voice was low. Too low. Explain.
Hello everyone. We now have a Discord server. Join us for faster updates, discussions about your favorite novels, and exclusive Discord-only content. Don't miss out. See you there. Scan the QR code on the screen or enter any of the displayed links into your browser to join our Discord.